Hello, people of Earth. My name's Luke Johnson, and I'm joined by Bob Schut. And we're going to be talking about something real happy today. We're going to be talking about, especially in regards to relationships. And I look forward to this because I just off camera had a pretty heavy conversation with Bob. So it'll be nice to spread the good news of Christian love with Bob. How are you doing today, Bob?
I'm doing pretty well, thank you. And yourself, you doing okay?
I soon will be once we get into this here. So what did you think about this section before we get going?
I thought it was a little easier to tackle. I thought it was very thoughtful, though. I think it was something positive. I think that's something that we can all relate to, I guess is pretty good. We can easily relate to something like this. So hopefully we can interpret him in the same way that I understood him in the simple ideas. So that'll be up to us.
Yeah, I wish Kierkegaard would write this way all the time. The past 6 weeks or so, we've had some pretty convoluting passages that we've had to unpack. I found this one to be rather simple, perhaps deceptively simple, and Bob will point out like, oh, Luke, you've totally oversimplified it. And I'm really glad that I drew this card, because next week it may be more difficult. So we're going to be doing, I believe this is installment 20 of our seminar series, and we're going to be looking at section 6 called, are we in part 2? It's part 2, section 6, is that right?
I think so.
Okay, so it's called Love Abides, and it's taking its cue from 1 Corinthians 13:13, where Kierkegaard quotes it. He goes, so, ellipses, 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 love abides. So, no matter how much the world rejects us, love abides. There is always love, specifically eternal love. To know love is more blessed than any accomplishment that we could have in this world. It fights off the despondency associated with the repetition of life. And love endures when we grow so weary and begin to think that Christ may have only faintly existed. But thankfully, God's love always abides. Something we should note is that no human being is love. Only God is love. However, if one is to live in love, love is present wherever one finds the true lover. One might think that a relationship between a man and a man involves only two. But Kierkegaard says this is not entirely true, and that the correct answer ought to be 3. So how does Kierkegaard arrive at the number 3? There's the lover, the object of the love, but then also love itself. When love abides, what Kierkegaard implies here is that love is something actively acquired at every moment. He calls it, in air quotes, active deed. And we might need to pause and reflect on what it means for love to be an active deed. And I think that'd probably be a good opportunity to let Bob weigh in on that.
Okay, well, yeah, I think it's, I had some notes on that, the previous idea that there's certainly times when nothing seems to turn out right for us, and those times when our lives don't really seem to be going anywhere. And I wanted to just kind of dwell on that for a minute, because I think there's a lot of people that are in that state. I've certainly been in that state from time to time, and I'm not immune to it even now. But God's presence sometimes even seems far from us, he tells us. We may be able to muster up the strength to go to church, but our heart just doesn't seem to be in it. I think we're all in those kinds of low periods in our times. And then it might be comforting to know that other good and faithful believers have the same problem. But that doesn't make it go away. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, what do we do when we're in those kinds of situations, when we're in those low spiritual points? Our love of God must endure through these times. And that's the key word here, Luke, that Kierkegaard is going to use here, endurance of love. The difference of loves that makes one endure and the other not endure. So sometimes that endurance we may be called upon for just a short period. But sometimes we may be called upon to endure for years. And if we truly love God, it will endure as long as it needs to endure. And that's the measure of true love, he tells us. And so that hopefully will be a little hopeful for some of those people who are in that state right now where they're just wondering, what do I do with my life? Is it ever going to straighten out? Am I ever going to feel that spiritual high again? And the answer is yes. But you have to endure. God is teaching us endurance. And how do you teach somebody endurance? You have to put them through these particular times of stress, these times of difficulty in order to do that. Would you agree? Would you that you've ever felt that and can now think that that's what Kierkegaard is getting at here in one way or another about teaching us about endurance of love?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about it in regards to my own personal life. It seems like the trajectory for my own, and this is not usual. It seems the older I get, the more intense my relationship with God becomes. I have a lot of friends who grew up in very evangelical, born again situations, and then lost their faith, and it was precipitated by a period of feeling distance from God. Mm-hmm. I've always felt like I've been on this path of convergence. I may not have been as close at the beginning as many of people, and I'm jealous. Like I am actively jealous about people who got saved as like teenagers. I think about all the time they had to preach the gospel to people, whereas for me, it was like a very incremental process of discovery and investigation until finally, especially I would say this year, I had sort of what I guess I would call a born again experience. I always sort of identified as an intellectual Christian, but now I feel like I'm in God's love in a way I wasn't ever before. So I think there's two questions here. Is about why people feel distance from God. What are the conditions that make them feel that they're apart from God, and how it's connected to this idea of being involved with God being an active deed. I didn't know if this would come up in conversation, but I recently reconnected with a friend of mine, and she had we had a wonderful conversation last night. Her name is Daniela, and we were classmates at NYU. And she was telling me that no one really taught her about how to have faith, and she figured out this process for herself to meditate on each line of the Lord's Prayer and to really search her soul during each line of the Lord's Prayer, so that it really does become her daily bread, where she feels like she is in this active, dynamic relationship with God. Mm-hmm. And I guess I feel like I've been in that way too and I thought that was an incredible insight and something that I haven't had a chance to practice yet, but I told her that I would try it and see what would happen. I don't know if you've ever heard of anyone doing that, but I thought it was really wonderful, because the Lord's Prayer is something I think a lot of us just sort of pray rotely, kind of as a ritual almost, and not really think about what it means, like give us our daily bread. I try to read scripture every day, so I feel very close to God right now. I've never had a falling away where I was close, but maybe that's a trial for me to endure in the future, and maybe that would happen as the result of not reading the Bible every day or of not praying every day. What do you think the sources are of separation? Why do you think people feel distant from God?
I think that that experiences in this life can do it to us. It puts us, I don't want to call it a mood, but I think that life can sometimes, it's a battleground, Luke, and sometimes we get the feeling that we're not winning the battle.
Yeah.
We're still fighting. We're still fighting in the war, but sometimes we just don't get the feeling that we're winning a battle, or we don't get the feeling that the role that we have in the battle is very significant. We may be asked to stay behind the lines and do bookkeeping or something or whatever, and you think to yourself, what am I doing for God? You know, why doesn't he call me to something bigger? And we keep waiting for that calling, and we just don't hear anything, and it kind of can wear you down. I think lack of the sense of direction can happen. Right now, I think you have a very good sense of direction. You feel you're being directed by God. But sometimes people, and you may always feel that, and I'll pray that you always do, but sometimes people get in a situation where they don't feel that calling so much, that clarity. They don't see the clarity of their lives and the purpose of their lives so much. And it becomes a struggle. And there doesn't seem to be a way out of it, because it's not something we can do. It's not, you know, we can't say, okay, God, now I want you to make your move. I'm ready. Are you ready? You know, it doesn't work like that. God is always trying to make his move, but we just have to wait and be patient. And so it's part of endurance. It's part of learning endurance. And some of us are called to learn that. Maybe they were called to learn it in order to help others who are going through it. I don't know.
You know, what's interesting is that I like how you talked about how we're like in this battle. It does seem like we are born into this spiritual warfare, and we don't even know that we're a part of it. I feel a calling. You know, even if my life does seem to be some sort of vain repetition, you know, does seem to be like bookkeeping, does seem to be the same sort of drudgery in and out. I think you know, this is just personal confession time, and I don't mind sharing this with people. I've changed how I measure my days. You know, how I measure my days is no longer how much philosophy did I read, or how much did I grow my company, or, you know, how much money did I make, or anything like that, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think about, like, for me, I'm like, it sounds really crazy, Bob. I don't know what you'll think about if I say this. I hope you don't mind me saying this on air. But I've started to measure my days in such a way I was like, did I tell one person about Jesus today?
Yeah. Yeah.
Did I share the message of Jesus Christ with another human being?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, I think where I am right now is that even if everything else isn't going the way that I want it to go, did I at least accomplish that? And if I did, I think that would be a huge accomplishment, because we're talking about timelines of eternity here. And if we're ultimately able to bring our person over, I mean, then there is no vain repetition.
Right.
What do you think about it? Is that an extreme view? I mean, did I just make everybody turn off? Did I just lose all credibility by saying that?
Not with me at all. I think that it's easy to go about. I mean, that's not easy, but it's different when you're feeling a spiritual high to go out and preach and do what you need to do. You're high, you know. It's like the Holy Spirit has got you way up here, and it's almost easy to tell other people. But what about when you're not at that spiritual high? Can you still tell other people about Jesus? You know, can you work under more adverse circumstances? Not everybody, and I don't mean that you're on a spiritual high, but I'm just kind of picturing the image of certain people, and it seems to be so easy for them sometimes to get into it. But what about when you're not at that level? Can you still go with authority and with sincerity and tell people about the love of Jesus, even though you may not feel that your purpose in life is that grand, that your calling is not to something greater, that you're not going to be a pastor of 10,000 people church, you know, and people aren't going to fall down when you bring the gospel to them. You know, how do you handle those things when you're not at that spiritual level. You're not feeling it, so to speak. You have to continue to endure and tell people.
Well, to be honest, I think I would trust the person who is battling through and yet still offers the testimonial more than the person that's on the spiritual high. The person that's on the spiritual high, we don't know if they've been tested. We don't know if their faith is authentic. They could be drunk on zeal. I think there's a lot to be said for individuals who have been engaged in spiritual battle and have not given up the fight and still say, hey, and so offer testimonial for Jesus Christ. And I would say that really my life, especially this year, has been the tale of two cities. On the one hand, there's been this incredible realization about the fallen nature of the world that is incredibly upsetting. And on the other hand, there's been this incredible joy to know that it's not going to always be like this, that there's a way out. So I guess personally, I hope that I communicate that testimonial with an earnestness that maybe a televangelist with a $1 million smile and a nice suit and a nice haircut, maybe, I don't know, maybe someone might be more likely to believe it if it's coming from me. I have no idea. I don't know how it will all sort out.
Well, I'll continue. I'm sorry.
That's it.
Oh, okay. I think that one of the things that we have to consider also is when we're preaching, teaching, or witnessing, probably a better word, when we're witnessing the gospel, are we witnessing a gospel of a spiritual high? Is that what we're trying to bring to the person? Believe in Jesus because you're going to experience these great experiences of being spiritually high, this euphoric sense of God. Or are we preaching the love of God? Are we preaching the cross to the person, which is what we're supposed to be preaching?
Right.
Sometimes we get distracted in thinking that the gospel is a spiritual high, and it isn't.
No. Kierkegaard himself says, if where did he say this? I'll have to look it up when you start talking again. But he said something to the effect of, if one wants an easy life, by no means choose Christianity. Do you remember him saying that?
Yeah, I think we just covered it, or maybe it was at the beginning of this book, or it was the end of the last one that we covered. But yeah, I remember that recently, and we talked about that. So yes, and that's not exactly how it's brought across anymore. And I'm wondering about a lot of people, if they're being distracted by that sense of spiritual high. And not that we shouldn't have that, I don't want to say we shouldn't have it, but that is not the gospel. The gospel is the cross, the gospel of the love of God, love of Christ, and our love for him. So he kind of Kierkegaard opens up with that kind of thought. I took it a little bit further than he did because I thought it was important to make that point in our podcast. And then he went on, and then you mentioned this, how you just kind of touched on that second part where he talks about this triad of the lover, the beloved, and love itself. And the way I looked at it is that you have two people that instead of loving one another directly, they love each other through this mediation of love.
Right.
And it's love. It's like loving love, which is taking it to a little bit of a different level than maybe he did. But we have to love love. And if we do that, that's how we get to that intermediate state. So we never get disappointed. We can continue to endure because it's not that we're so much in love with the other individual as we are in love with them through love. So we have to have that intermediary or the intermittent step of love.
Yeah, he's going to elaborate that on a lot more here. So let me I don't have a lot of notes for this because it is pretty succinct. So let's try to cover that and then address some of the issues that are associated with it. If that's okay, do you mind if I proceed?
No, yeah, go right ahead.
So the lover abides and preserves himself in love and demonstrates this relationship towards men. His love is continual, but we need to say something more about this continuance. And that leads us to the section that love abides. It says love never fails, it abides. One who truly loves without ceasing. If you cease, you never really loved. If there's a breaking point, a point of division, there are always just two people involved, not three entities. So what does Christianity do about it? How does Christianity maintain the love between men and remain open to forgiveness? And I like this quote from page 283 of the Harper Torchbooks edition that I use. Kierkegaard writes, "The earnestness of Christianity immediately concentrates the attentiveness of the eternal upon the single individual, upon each single individual of the pair. Now, when two persons relate themselves in love to each other, each one of them, all by himself, is related to love. Now the break does not come easily at all. Before they reach the breaking point, before one comes to break his love in relationship to the other, he must first fall away from love. In short, once you're in the grasp of the eternal, it is very difficult to give up on people without also departing from eternal love." One might say big deal, but if anyone knows about the commitment to eternal love, such an idea raises interesting questions about whether one can ever lose their eternal salvation after repentance. Probably something that we should discuss. It may seem like a big deal to us at the time if we break with someone we merely have erotic love for. What is much more dangerous is to fall away from the eternal. And this is the true danger, and we get this confused. For like many things, we have fallen for a counterfeit of true love. That's probably a nice little deception by the adversary, in my humble opinion. So let's just kind of, I kind of threw out a lot of, let me try to restate this. What I'm trying to say here is the following, is that if we do have this commitment to eternal love, we are not going to go around breaking off relationships because the next best thing comes around, or we reprioritize and shuffle things. We're not going to leave someone in the lurch. And if we are inclined to do that, that probably involves a violation of our commitment to the eternal to begin with, or it signals that we never ever actually had it. And we may think that we exercise some sort of power in the relationship with another person, be it platonic or erotic, because we're the one that divorced ourselves from the situation. But the reality is, what Kierkegaard's trying to say to us is that we're playing a very dangerous game. Is that if we so easily walk away from another person, what we're really doing is walking away from eternal love. And when we're walking away from eternal love, well, then we're walking away from eternal salvation. Do you think I kind of captured the gist of what he's trying to say?
Yeah, it's very important to focus on that, because he focuses on that idea of the temporal versus the eternal again. That the love he's talking about, when he talks about romantic love, he's talking about love in the temporal. And when one person says, "It's over, I'm breaking up with you," we're talking about something that exists in time, or something that has a past. He talks about it. It ends. But he says, when you talk about love, divine love, love for your brother, neighborly love, or love for a Christian brother, even love for God, really, that it's eternal love, and therefore it never reaches the point of a breakup, because in eternity there's always hope.
Right.
See, in romantic love, the door can be closed. Somebody files divorce papers, you sign, it's over. Okay? Not completely, of course, but it's kind of over. The love ends, you move on, you do something else. But in the kind of love he's talking about, divine and Christian love, you don't have divorce papers. And I thought this is very interesting. He didn't exactly say it that way, but as my own thoughts developed, then I went back to Jesus's teachings on divorce. And I thought, well, there's really a connection here. Why was Jesus so against divorce? And I think that's partially the reason, maybe even most of the reason, is because the love that we have is eternal. There is no divorce in eternity. And marriage symbolizes our relationship with Christ. So therefore, symbolically speaking, he could never approve of divorce because it would be a temporal break. And the relationship we have with God and with our neighbor is not temporal, it's eternal. And so I kind of made that connection there. Do you see that connection, or is that just
Yeah, no. I think I'm totally picking up on what you're putting down. I was just kind of curious, off the top of your head, what Jesus explicitly said about divorce. Like, I've read so much of the Bible recently. I get all the different maxims and aphorisms about divorce. I think it would be enlightening if you could share what he said.
Well, I think he said, for this reason, a man shall leave his parents and shall become one with another man, and the two shall become one, rather, I should say. And that this relationship, I'm trying to think of how he phrases it now. It's in Matthew. He talks about it right in this, I think, in the Sermon on the Mount, when he's approached by the Pharisees because they wanted to know what his feelings were on divorce. They were trying to entrap him. And so they said, is it right that a man should give like Moses said, just give a written statement that there should be a divorce? And Jesus says, no. I wish I could think of exactly. Let me search that out while you're talking, see what I can find. I want to quote it correctly.
Right, because it raises an interesting question that I brought up later in the conversation, but I don't mind talking about it while you're looking it up, is that I think if we are properly committed to eternal love, to God, there is no past. I mean, I've had this play out in my life this year as I've gone deeper into my religious experience, where people that I have had breaks with, I've been able to receive back with a receptivity that I don't think I would have in the past. And too much to their surprise, they said, someone said recently, I was like, well, how did you let that go? I'm just like, there's so much that's on my mind. I had forgotten about it. And I really didn't draw the connection here. But, Kierkegaard's going to go on to say that, when one has really made that authentic connection to eternal love, you have nothing but hopeful expectancy. You don't have time to dwell on the past. You're trying to live your life as this, as we mentioned last week, or maybe last week or 2 weeks ago, as this sort of awesome extension of God's love. And it always has to be seeking out new possibilities to demonstrate it or testify to it to other human beings, and also to forgive people. You're always looking for an opportunity to evangelize or forgive. I think if you really made that authentic conversion experience. But I think what's sort of interesting is that if you did find yourself romantically broken off with someone, and one of the parties was to move on, if one of the other parties was to get married or to get into a new relationship or something like that, and the individual wanted to come back and be reconciled in some way, I wonder if there's a way that one could be reconciled, but perhaps alter the dynamic of the temporal relationship. So if it was a former lover, if they could be someone that you could just care about and could be a friend that you could be there for, if that would be part of this forgiveness that acts as if there was no break whatsoever. So I hope I did enough song and dance there for you to look up what you were looking up.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I did. I was wrong. It wasn't in the Sermon on the Mount. It comes later in chapter 19 of Matthew. Then some Pharisees came to him in order to test him, and they said, "Is it lawful to divorce a wife for any cause?" And he answered, "Have you not read that from the beginning the Creator made them male and female? And said, for this reason the man will leave his father and mother and be united with his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." And they said, "Why then did Moses command us to give a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her?" Jesus said to them, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because of your hard hearts, but from the beginning it was not this way." And then he goes on to talk about, being adultery, the idea that if you married a divorced person, it was adultery. So he was a purist in this sense. And I think the purity of marriage is very symbolic of the wedding between Jesus and the church. And so it's so important that we understand that connection, that for a Christian, their marriage is a symbol of the marriage between Christ and the church. So there's no reason, because it's an eternal marriage between the church and between Christ. So Christ just can't offer us a certificate at one time and say, Bob, I'm kind of tired of you and all your problems. Here's your certificate of divorce. He doesn't do that. He doesn't divorce us. And that, I think, should be comforting to somebody. He just won't do that because it's against his own promise.
So I think this is really wise advice for those of us. I think this is wise advice for you and me, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'm single. I've never been married. I intend to be married once, and that's it. All right. Bob's never been divorced. But I have a lot of good friends who are Christian and divorced, and they might be listening to this and they might be saying, well, great, am I marked? Am I not? Did I violate this communion between man and woman and God, and am I no longer worthy of God's grace? Or if someone is currently a Christian and is in a marriage, and let's say the individual they're married to has fallen away from the faith and has been given over to some incredibly reckless disorder, or maybe one person got converted in the marriage and now lives life differently. Maybe they were able to shed some crazy harmful disorder. What do we say to people that are in these very ambiguous zones? You and I are kind of living black and white things where things are neat and tidy, but life doesn't always work out like that. I'm sure over the years as a Bible teacher, you've counseled people in these scenarios. What would you say?
Well, I guess what I would say initially is that each person has to examine themselves, and if they feel that they've divorced and now realize that maybe they shouldn't have done it because it was a violation of what Jesus commands, we have this thing called repentance, to say, look, I'm sorry, Lord, I made a mistake, and I can't undo it now, but if we admit that we made a mistake, it's okay. If we try to defend it, that's a whole different issue. If we're going through a problem, Paul was a very reasonable man. He said, if you're married to an unbeliever and you try to convert that person and they just won't have any part of it, he says you're unevenly yoked. He says you have to be free to leave, and you're not held to that marriage, because it wasn't a marriage under God. It wasn't a marriage in God. If a person leaves the faith, it's kind of the same thing. They've broken off the vow. And Jesus even makes a statement that except for the purpose, divorce isn't permitted except for the purpose of adultery, because the reflection of adultery is if we go after other gods, God will divorce us. He will divorce us if we go after other gods. He's done it to the Jews. he'll do it to us. So that's a valid reason to leave if you want to take it, unless you can always, turn the other cheek and say, okay, are you sorry for your adultery? And if they confess it, you try to take them back again. So we have to be reasonable about it. We have to think about how it's going to affect our faith. So our faith has to be foremost in that decision. Does our marriage reflect the marriage that Christ has towards us? Do we remember Jesus is married to us? Are we the action that we take towards our husband or wife is like saying, I'm comfortable if the Lord takes the same action to me. In other words, as I forgive other people's trespasses, I'll expect to be for God to forgive me. But if I don't forgive trespasses again with other people, then I can't expect God to forgive me. And I think the same thing reflects in a marriage. It's how you treat your husband or your wife. You have to expect that's how God is going to treat you.
It's interesting that you defined it. You defined adultery more liberally. I never really thought about it like that. I always thought about adultery as, having an affair. But I think it's kind of interesting that you expanded it to adultery being spiritually adulterous, chasing after other gods. It's an interesting nuance to meditate on. It's something I'll have to take to my as we finish up here. But let's move on. So going back to these breaks that we can have with people, the break can really weigh one down if you do not have the power of the eternal. It builds up day by day. I know about this, year by year. Think about what you could have done differently, how you could have saved it. But Kierkegaard says that is why the power of the eternal is so necessary, and is constantly orienting us towards the future with hopeful expectancy, so we are not dwelling on the past. And what I can gather from Kierkegaard here is that if we are delivered to the eternal love, our goal is to share that love with as many new people and wait for our blessed reunion with God. And as always, forward-looking. It's not the time to dwell on what went wrong. I mentioned this earlier. So it also seems to follow that the person who has the eternal impressed upon them is ready to receive the lover back. And I thought this was kind of clever, and we've danced around this already, but what if people aren't talking? And Kierkegaard, why should there be any hope in a reunification? And what I liked about what Kierkegaard had to say about this is that he said, Kierkegaard said that, silence can be part of a conversation, and that we ought to consider it as such, which is really interesting because, Bob, I try to, with this deeper religious experience that I've had, I've really, searched my soul. I'm like, is there anyone that I haven't forgiven? Yeah. Like really just kind of like try to splay myself open and be like, did I really do that? And, there are a couple people out there who I haven't talked to.
Yeah.
And I've made some initial efforts to say, hey, I'm ready to talk. And they're not. They're not.
Yeah.
They're not. And it's been disheartening, but I think is the idea that silence can be a form of communication, that letting people be is still, it's this pregnant pause that allows them to really sort of prepare themselves for a reconciliation one day. Just like you and I are talking right now. You're not talking, like you and I are having a more immediate conversation, but as I'm talking, you are silent, right? And when you're talking, generally, if I'm being well-mannered, I'm not interrupting you, I am silent. And I like this idea of how he expands it out. He's like, we're just in a really big conversation. And sometimes one person doesn't say anything for 3 years, you know, or 30 or whatever, but they may reply, and that we should not give up on them. And the true lover has to abide in that love and wait for them to come back and receive them back with true love. What do you think? Does that make sense?
It does. It does. As a matter of fact, I have a quotation here from one of my favorite philosophers, Yogi Berra. I believe he's the one who said it's never over till it's over. And in the eternal, it's never over. So that silence is never over until eternity, you know, until the coming, I guess, until time ends. So there's always room for something to happen. And so we always leave the door open. You know, once the gate is closed, of course, that's a different period. That's when time ends. But as long as we're on the clock, so to speak, we have to leave the door open for other people and for ourselves. We have to always be hopeful that something can change. So that's kind of what I would, let's see, there is another comment. Let's see. He talks about seeing things from the angle of the past. Do you remember him saying that?
Yeah.
He says that, yeah, that the temporal extends into the infinite, and therefore the past is not complete. This idea of being complete is interesting because the word in Greek for complete is called telos. Telos means actually to be not just finished, but to be perfected.
Are you saying telos or telos? What word?
Well, it's T-E-L-O-S, telos.
See, I always thought that meant there was sort of a trajectory.
Okay, well, a telos is actually, you may be in some peripheral idea, it might work, but the idea of telos is something that fulfills its destiny, something that's designed for something, and it fulfills that particular destiny. And so
you're right. You're right. It's an end or purpose.
Yeah, it's a purpose that
as
comes
Aristotle
about.
used it.
Yeah, and I think that's important to see here, that we really don't know what the purpose of something is, so we have to leave that open. So that perfection is a process that's taking place, and during that silent period that you're talking about, that's the time that maybe perfection is taking place. And same thing, even during that time when we feel abandoned by God, that perfection is still taking place. So just because we don't hear God or feel him does not mean that nothing's happening, because perfection is still taking place in our lives. That silence is part of the conversation, as you kind of put it. So just kind of trying to put some context to that.
How do you think we can let people know that we'll be there for them when they are ready?
If it's a personal thing, I think that not to be judgmental towards them, to leave that open, always let them know the door is open, to smile, to be kind, to speak kind words, to make contact with them, and even just directly tell them, you know, I love you, the door is open whenever you're ready. There's no shame in that. It takes humility, but I think it works. I think it works. Recently, I was telling you the story about the new lady who came to my Bible study, and we talked and we had nice conversations. And after the lesson, she says, you know, I'm an atheist. And we were all kind of surprised, you know, but we all said, well, we love you anyway. You know, we love you. Please feel free to come back again. Feel free to discuss, make anything you want to discuss with us. We left the door open for her. We didn't say, well, you know, if you're an atheist, you're not welcome here. you know. So we left the door open for her to come back, and we smiled and we tried to be nice and kind to her. So that's all I think we can do for anybody.
Yeah. I think I still have some work to do on some things.
I think we all do, Luke.
Yeah. No, Bob, you're perfect.
I'm being perfected, and it's not always a pleasant experience.
Oh, man. All right. So the final section here, it's called Love Abides, It Never Wastes Away. So we are to die with hopeful expectancy. On page 289, Kierkegaard writes, and I'm going to paraphrase, I'm going to leave out a few sentences, but so we can get the gist here. When he dies, he is right at the goal. When he dies, it just proves that he did not expect in vain.
Mm-hmm.
Which gives a human being immortality. What else but the love which abides? And yeah, man. I'm a younger guy, I guess. I mean, I guess I'm middle-aged. I don't know what I am. I'm 37. But, I think I'm here for a purpose, I guess. I was talking to Bob before we started what that purpose is I thought it was one thing and other, and I'm trying to make sense of it all in a hurry. But I get the idea of finishing well. I want to go home.
Yeah.
And I'm 37. I'm not 87. And that's weird, right? That's weird for a 37-year-old to say that, right? I want to go home. Is that weird?
Well, for a normal, I don't want to say normal, for a worldly person, yes, but not for a spiritual person.
Do you want to go home?
I do. Sometimes more than others,
Yeah.
But yes, I think it's not I shouldn't use the word resignation. It's not fatalism, though. People confuse that with fatalism. It's resignation, not fatalism. We resign ourselves to the Lord. We want to be with the Lord. But Paul said, he wanted to be with the Lord, but he knew that the people needed him more. So he had to stay.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of the position I feel in. I'm called upon to do something. I have to stay.
That's kind of how I feel too.
Yeah. Did you like the little story he gave about the woman? I have kind of captured a little bit that he had this wonderful comment here, so poetic.
Yeah. Why don't you take it? Go for it.
Okay. He says a failure in a relationship is that it exists in the temporal and is therefore susceptible to the elements of time. It not only wears away, but also wears away the lover. Now, he's talking about the worldly relationship here. And he talks about erotic love, and he talks about this woman who has a lover, and I guess she breaks up with him, and she just waits and tries to wait him out in erotic love. And he just keeps waiting and waiting. And it says time goes on and on. He speaks of the girl who does not mark how time came and went while she waited, although time marked her. And I thought that was so clever, because sometimes that's true. Sometimes we wait and wait and wait, and we don't realize how much time is going by. But at the same time, time is having its effects upon us, because time, in this sense, is destructive. It destroys the individual when we wait without the eternal in mind. So a romantic or an erotic love can be very destructive. And he gives this idea of her wasting away. Even though the poet writes poems about her, telling how wonderful this is, in reality, it's not wonderful at all to waste away. And in true love, there is no wasting away. So he makes this comparison. And in the true love, in eternal love, there is no wasting away. And this is a great example how time enters into worldly love. So we make that comparison. the eternal, there we wait, but time does not erode us. It does not erode our love. Our love is still there, because it's not so much we're in love with the other individuals directly, but because we're in love with them through love. Because we love love, it enables us to be protected. So there's like that level of insulation, that level of protection. But when I think he says we love love, oh, well, actually, that's my statement, love love. His statement is that love is like the intermediary. I think he's speaking here about our love for God.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what he's saying is that the true lover knows no unrest, like the young woman who is consumed by her erotic love for the lover that she's waiting on, because we're eternally constituted.
Yeah.
I also think what he's trying to say is when the erotic lover waits for the turn of the one who broke it off, this is a sad contradiction, for the passion of eternity is applied to something temporal.
Mm-hmm.
And that object is ill-suited for the designated passion, and that we can only have eternal faithfulness for the eternal. And you know what's something that's interesting as we talk about this, we've talked all about love here, right, Bob? Romantic,
yeah.
Eternal. You know what we have not mentioned, which is like just says how much we were kind of wrapped up in everything else? We have not mentioned anything about Kierkegaard's love life.
No,
we
have not.
I don't know how we've done. I don't know if we've done it the entire time we've been talking about works of love. But famously, or infamously, Kierkegaard, and especially we should talk about it in regards to this section.
Yeah.
Kierkegaard was engaged to Regine Olsen, and he broke it off. But and she remarried, and he sent secret messages to her through probably this book right here. He's probably trying to tell Regine something right here.
Yeah, probably.
Probably. All his life, he never really stopped loving her. I think, if I have the story right, don't quote me on this, but I think he left what little he had to her, even though she went off and got married to somebody else. I mean, just let's play psychiatrist for a second. I mean, obviously Kierkegaard is drawing from his relationship with Regine, because he was the one in the position of authority, right? Like he was the one that ended the relationship, and her father was pleading with him to reconsider, and he tried to pretend that he was some sort of scoundrel and make her angry and not love him, is like this sort of subterfuge so he could really get away, so he could do his, I guess what he believed was his divinely appointed duty to write all these books and convert all of us to Christianity through existentialism. Is there some sort of confession going on here with or is Kierkegaard trying to tell us what was going on in his mind, or that he would take Regine back if he ever came back, or if she ever came back? I hadn't even thought about it in preparation for today, which I don't know, man. Maybe I've just been too distracted by too many other things. What about that?
I actually did think about it, Luke. I actually thought about it, and I was thinking, he's writing about works of love, and he's talking about all this romantic love and making comparisons. How does he know so much about it when he really doesn't have a lot of experience in the world of love? Not the kind that we talk about, but he has this fascination, this love for Regina, and he's drawing on that, obviously. But he makes, I don't know, does this sound like a clue here, Luke? He talks about, where is that? That if a relationship breaks up, and he says that it would be even more distressing, is that if this misunderstanding turned around and sought understanding and brought about a reconciliation, it would be more distressing than if the lover had wasted away, because that would prevent the true love from coming about in the eternal. Is he saying there, you think, that even though he loved her, he knew that a reconciliation would not work for them, because he has a higher level of love now, and by reestablishing a relationship with her would have been to kind of fall back into a temporal relationship with her that would be worse off than the spiritual relationship that he had with her and for her, perhaps.
That's an interesting theory. I guess if we were to plumb the depths of his psychology here, one of the reasons we could say he might have broken the relationship off, and maybe it was the ultimate reason. What do we know? Was that maybe he felt like they were too enamored with one another and not enough with God, and he had to force a separation so that she would not be so enamored with him, but love God more than him, and maybe that he could do the same. But then maybe somehow he also talks about this sort of scenario. I believe it's in Fear and Trembling, where he talks about the return of the lover, or the peasant and the princess. I forget the exact story, but it seemed like he thought, like, maybe after a period of separation where there could be this realization of a spiritual love, that maybe that it could be reconciled in the right way, where they could be united in spiritual love. But maybe it seems like at that stage that they were given over to eroticism.
Yeah.
But then when maybe he was mature enough to actually have that spiritual loving relationship, she had already been swept off her feet by somebody else, and that ship had sailed.
Yeah, it sounds like he's kind of thinking out loud here, but I'm wondering, I can't remember now, what was the date, the year that this was written?
Let me, I'd have to, let me.
1847, I think. Works as Love was published. Yeah, okay, 1847. So that's about in the middle. That's about in the middle of his work, isn't it? Somewhere around the middle.
Yeah, because he would, he died in what, 1855?
Yeah, 55. So that puts him somewhere around the middle, I guess.
Yeah.
So he may be just kind of thinking about that relationship a lot of times, even unconsciously thinking when he's writing these things.
Yeah, so he broke off the engagement with Regine on August 11th, 1841. And when did you say that he?
47. Yeah, 47.
So this is 6 years later.
Yeah.
Huh. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting stuff. Can't believe we haven't talked more about that.
Well, there's not a lot to talk about. We don't really, he didn't really give us too much. He just kind of subtly gives us these points that maybe we're reading too much into it, but I don't know.
No. He's trying. He's talking. Kierkegaard. He's talking on a couple levels at once.
I know he is. Yeah.
He's hyperdimensional. All right. So to close it out here, again, the true lover can reconcile because he always discards the past. Reconciliation always exists as if there had been no separation. It is nearly impossible to rebuild what was lost in friendship or erotic love so long as people are holding on to the past. But for the true lover, the past does not exist, and he forgives easily. The shock of being reunited is mitigated because abiding love always allows for forgiveness. So that's what I had prepared for today. I think, look, I think that was a pretty good lesson. Would you like to say anything else, Bob?
One more thing.
Sure.
He makes a comment here that he says, if there is a break in love in the temporal world, it can never become fully reestablished. In a sense, the dream is destroyed. So I think he's telling us here that there's damage done when there's a destroyed relationship. It'll never be fully reestablished. Like if there was an adulterous affair in a worldly relationship, even though they take each other back again, it's like something was still destroyed. You can never fully reestablish the innocence that you first had, but in the eternal, reconciliation becomes lost in eternity. So that moment in time when there was not a break, but an attempt at a break, the reconciliation, when we start to talk again, you know, in that silent period, when we start to speak again, the silence is lost in eternity. What seemed like years has now been collapsed into just a very short moment in that spiritual sense of reconciliation. So that was my last comment. I thought I would throw that out.
I think that's very true. You can't go back. You can't step in the same river twice, right? So as long as you're in the erotic categories, my experience is that you can't go back, and right. You have to dramatically reset the categories that you exist in if you're going to even have a shot. Because I mean, there are people who overcome affairs and adultery and have good marriages. It is possible, but it seems you have to do something pretty revolutionary to get there.
Yeah.
And my advice to anyone who would be having such relationship struggles is to rebuild your relationship on faith. Because I don't know how else we can forgive such a violation of the trust. Mm-hmm. I personally don't think we can do it on our own. I mean, maybe someone else out there can. I don't think I could.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, what do you think? I think we did a good job, Bob.
I think so.
I think it was good back and forth, good banter.
That's what we do well, right? You and I.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Well, I want to thank Bob for everything he does, and it's obvious that he does a lot. You can watch this on YouTube and listen to it on your podcasting app. You can download the Noetic app and listen there. And we're just going to keep on building. Thank you so much, Bob, for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Luke.
All right. All right. In communique.